The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Welcome to a discussion with Penelope Lively. I'm Kathleen Baxter from the Anoka County Library, and our guest today is Penelope Lively, one of the most distinguished writers in England, or as far as I'm concerned, or most people would be in the world. She's won the Booker Prize in England, which is inconceivably prestigious, and she's won the Carnegie Medal in England for her book, The Ghost of Thomas Kemp, and that's for the best written children's book of the year. And Moon Tiger won the Booker Prize, and that's an adult novel. The Ghost of Thomas Kemp is a children's novel, and I know of no one in the United States or England who's won both the best children's book of the year and the best novel of the year. This is incredibly wonderful and quite an honor.
Well, there aren't a lot of people, I suppose, who write seriously for adults and for children, and I always did, although that being said, I haven't written for children for quite a while now, but for a while I was writing equally seriously for both, and although obviously it's a different activity, there is a difference between writing for children and writing for adults. It's not, as far as I'm concerned, qualitatively different. I wasn't turning myself into a different person, so there would be a kind of a house style that would be the same in both, and I was trying to write for children out of the same concerns that I was writing for adults, so it was the same person who was doing both.
Did you make a conscious decision to switch to adult novels? I read that you say you felt you were in danger of writing the same children's book over and over again.
There was a bit of that, yes. I'd been writing for children for 10 years or so, and I felt I was in danger of writing myself out, as it were. I thought that it was time maybe to stop. And by then, too, I was writing both adult and children's fiction. And there are only so many hours in the day. It was difficult to do that much. And I'm also a short story writer. I believe very passionately in the importance of the short story as a fictional form and get immense satisfaction out of writing them, and they are a very different form as well. And it seemed to me that some sort of choice had to be made. I couldn't go on doing everything, and especially, of course, the concerns, the interests that I was writing out of were complex, and I ceased to see a way of writing about them for children, really. I needed to be writing much more for adults, so that was how it came about.
And this year, in 1994, you saw the publication, I should say, of the book Oleander Jacaranda, which is A Childhood Perceived, which is an incredibly interesting title, about your youth, your first 12 years, which you spent with brief expeditions to England in Egypt. And it's an absolutely wonderful book. I shed tears at the end, and I've been reading passages aloud to people over the last few days with the sheer joy of it. It's a wonderful, wonderful book about your youth, and yet I have to quote something you said. We like the past gutted and nicely cleaned up, then we know where we are with it. And this book is not nicely gutted and cleaned up. There are all sorts of loose ends hanging all over it. You read the book and you're dying to know more about who you are, what became of you, what happened to the people in the book, what happened to Lucy, what happened to your mother. Have you forgiven your mother? Could you ever forgive your mother? How do you feel about your parents? How did your father remarry? You have numerous questions, and there's no little thing at the end that tells us.
Well, that quotation that you gave about liking the past nicely gutted and cleaned up, when I was saying that, I think what I was talking about was people's reactions to the past, or the way that we look at the past now, meaning the historical past, and the way in which the past is presented by means of theme parks and heritage trails and all this kind of thing. So as I was really talking about something else, I was talking about a sort of collective public way of looking at the past. And I don't think that the personal past in any sense can be gutted or cleaned up. Absolutely not. And when I wrote this book, that was certainly not what I was trying to do. What I really set out to do was to use the kind of head full of frozen moments that we all have, all those slides of memory of childhood that everybody has in their head, which is no kind of sequence, but just like a kind of jumble of images. I wanted to take those out and look at them and turn them into language and put them down, and then try to see if I could use them as a way of looking at exploring and discussing the nature of childhood perception itself, as to use my adult wisdoms and adult experience to look at this sort of head full of slides and see if I could see through them how it is that a child perceives the world, how a child views the world. And because also obviously I had to talk about what it was that this particular child was seeing, it's also a book about Egypt and the Middle East before and during the war, because I was born in Cairo in Egypt and spent my entire childhood there, so that although I'm English, I didn't actually go to England until I was 12. England was a completely alien place to me, so it's not quite a straightforward childhood memoir, and it does in a sense leave a lot of questions unanswered, because it ends when I was 12 and arrived in England, arrived not back in England, but arrived in England for the first time, when my childhood came to a very abrupt end. So there are, as you say, a lot of loose ends.
You do have a lot of questions. And did you see your parents as you grew up a lot? I mean, did you become close to your mother ever again?
Well, my mother had not looked after me when I was a child. I mean,
Yes.
she did what was quite normal for English women of her time and her sort of society. She simply hired someone else to look after me from a baby onwards, so that I was effectively looked after by somebody called Lucy, who was first of all a kind of nanny, and then she turned herself into a governess. She also educated me, because I didn't go to a school. Allegedly, there was no suitable school to send me to, so I was educated at home by this person, Lucy, who was my surrogate mother, effectively. And indeed, I did see my mother very much later on, never very closely. In fact, the other kind of traumatic thing was that my parents were divorced when I was 12, and when I went back to England, it was to a home with my father, because my mother married somebody else and had not asked for custody in any case. Rather unusually, she effectively didn't want me, so my father had custody and I became his child. I continued to see my mother quite a lot, but have never really been close ever since. No, she's still alive. She's a very old lady and lives in a nursing home, and she's my responsibility, but it's not been a close relationship. Inevitably, I think that childhood is a strange and intensely important period, obviously, and I think that unless you have been cared for by your mother, you're not very likely to be very, very close to her in later life. I can understand circumstances in which you might, but something has been lost. Something has been lost that's irretrievable.
And you left Egypt in 1945, and you did not go back until 1984. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes, I went back for the first time then about 10 years or so ago, and partly to try to find my old home. Well, I wanted to go back to the country anyway and to see it and experience it again, but I wanted to see if possibly my old home still existed, which had been back then in my childhood, was outside Cairo. It was in open countryside, about 4 miles outside the centre of Cairo. And it was a big house with a huge garden next to another big house owned and lived in by Europeans, and surrounded by the open landscape, the open cultivation of the Egyptian delta, which is all sugarcane and bare seam and mud villages, and this was how it had been. But now, or rather then in 1984 when I went back, this whole area had become a teeming slum. It had been digested by Cairo. Cairo has doubled in size since the 1940s. It's now a city of 14 million people. It's one of the largest cities in the world, and has just gobbled up the entire surrounding landscape. So the area where my home was now an area of sort of jerry-built apartment blocks and kind of rubble-strewn streets. Anyway, we set off to try to find it, my husband and myself and some friends who were with us. We'd found an Arabic-speaking friend to escort us, and miraculously we did find it. It was still there. It was a kind of shell of what it had once been, and the garden had completely vanished and was covered in rubble, and there was a mosque, a new mosque next door, and apartment blocks all around. But there it was, which was a very strange experience to find this house, but with the surroundings completely changed. I felt like Rip Van Winkle.
Yes. Had you wanted to go prior to that, or why had you not gone back? Or?
I would have liked to, but circumstances didn't permit. It was just simply kind of straightforward things like money. It's quite an expensive trip, and we weren't a wealthy family, and my husband is an academic, and you only go to Egypt in winter. It's only sensible to go on a holiday to Egypt in the sort of autumn or winter or very early spring, because it's just too hot in the summer, and the British academic year doesn't work so that you could take a holiday in the winter. It was really just as simple as that. We hadn't had an opportunity.
I have to ask you, just what is the name of the house that you grew up with? We were talking earlier how you read words and you have no idea how they're pronounced. How do you pronounce the name of it?
It's Boulak El Dakrur. We called it just Boulak Dakrur, sort of ran it into one. And I don't know what it means exactly. Boulak, I think, is just a simple word that means place, village. There's another area of Cairo that's called Boulak as well. And then there was a village that was called Boulak Dakrur, which was a village of the kind of mud-built huts that the Fellahin lived in then, and mainly still do, in fact. Nowadays it's rather different, because nowadays they would have electricity because of the Nile Valley scheme and the Aswan Dam. Electricity is relatively cheap, and they have plenty of it, but back then it was before, so there would have been nothing like that. Very simple mud peasant dwellings and the open fields, and then this anachronism of these three large houses owned and lived in by Europeans, completely different.
It's so exotic. It just doesn't seem like very many American authors were brought up in exotic locales and then transported. That's only the British that do things like this.
Well, you see, the interesting thing is that to me as a child, it was not exotic at all. There was nothing exotic about it. It was ordinary. It was how the world is, because children accept absolutely what they're given, and I had been given this. I had been given this landscape and these circumstances of growing up as an English child, but surrounded by all the signals and assumptions of a different culture. And so I just simply accepted it as what else could there be? And also the other dimension that, of course, was different and strange was that the Second World War, for the second part of my childhood, from when I was 6 onwards, the Second World War was roaring away just a few hundred miles away in the desert, in the Libyan desert, so that the Germans were advancing across the Libyan desert towards Egypt, and it looked very much as though Egypt would fall. And the thing that I now find very strange, looking back and thinking about it, is that I don't recall any sense of sort of panic or anxiety on the part of my family or their friends. And yet, now that I read the war diaries and the war histories and everything, it's abundantly clear that to many people it must have been, the expectation must have been that in fact Rommel would push over the Egyptian frontier and that Egypt would fall to the Germans. And yet there was this extraordinary, rather sort of cavalier feeling that, it'll be all right. This passing local difficulty will end. In fact, just at the point, a few months before the Battle of Alamein, which was the turning point of the Libyan campaign, we did in fact go to Palestine, as it then was. All British women and children left Egypt and we moved to Palestine. But this, again, in my in my mind's eye in recollection. It was seen as just, changing the place where we usually went for a summer holiday. We normally went to Alexandria for the summer to escape the heat of Cairo. But instead, that summer, we went to Palestine and spent a few months there until after the Battle of Alamein, when the tide turned and Rommel's army was pushed back across the Libyan desert, and then we went home again to Bulaq Takrur. So this was the other kind of dimension of exoticism, but equally that didn't seem to me exotic at the time, because children accept what they're given. I just assumed that there is always a war going on.
I was surprised that you saw Charles de Gaulle in his dressing gown. And then in Moon Tiger, the heroine of the story had heard a rumor that he was in the Jerusalem area, but she couldn't confirm it. And of course, you could have confirmed it.
Well, I always like to say that I'm the last surviving Englishwoman to have seen the naked legs of Charles de Gaulle. Maybe there are others, and they'll come up and dispute this. Now, how this arose was that that in the summer of 1941, Charles de Gaulle was indeed in the Middle East. I've since read his memoirs and diaries, and he was there, but there is no mention of him having been in Jerusalem, where I know that I was, and I know that where I saw him in his dressing gown was Government House, which was the residence of the High Commissioner, who was the British representative in Palestine. And you have to remember, of course, that this was, in those years, it was the British mandate, and so Palestine was under British rule. This was before the State of Israel, and it was before all these immense changes in the Middle East. So that it was a time of British administration, and Government House was the seat of the British administration. And I stayed there with Lucy, my nurse, who looked after me, because previously she had looked after the children of the High Commissioner's wife, so that she was known to them, and we had been invited to stay there. And we had to share a bathroom with General de Gaulle, and my memory is that we were told to keep out of the way at the times when he needed to use the bathroom, but I peeked round the door and so saw this tall, sort of camel-like figure loping down the corridor, wearing a paisley dressing gown and carrying a sponge with these long white legs protruding beneath his dressing gown. So I offer that to de Gaulle's scholars as a little tidbit.
This book, it's just filled with wonderful things like that. What became of Lucy? I just have to ask. A nursemaid, she went on to work for other people and take care of other children?
She did, yes. Of course, when I came back to England, by then I was 12, and I hadn't had any formal education in the sense that I'd never been to a school. So my father decided quite rightly that it was time I went to a school. But very abruptly, and it now seems to me, rather harshly, Lucy and I were separated, and she went effectively. She went off and got another job looking after other children, and remained with that family for many years until eventually she retired. For me, obviously, this was deeply traumatic, and it must have been for her as well, because I'd been effectively her child for 12 years. I had been her entire life, as she had been my entire life. And so it was deeply traumatic, and I was certainly a very unhappy little girl at that stage. And many, many years later, when Lucy was an old lady, I always kept in touch with her, and I used to see her regularly. I'd visit her whenever I could, once or twice a year. But not long, she died about 5 or 6 years ago at a ripe old age. But a few years before that, when I was visiting her once, she mentioned that she had some letters of mine that I'd written her when I was a child, when I was a schoolgirl, and she said, "Would you like to have them?" And I said, yes. I didn't remember anything about these letters. I said, yes, I would like to. And she said, I don't know quite where I've put them, but when I find them, I'll send them to you. And a few weeks later, she did. And it was an enormous bundle of letters, and I read them over the course of a morning and was completely shattered by this, because I didn't remember the writing of any of these letters. I read them as though reading the letters of a stranger, and they were desperately sad, desperately sort of anguished cries of a very, very sad child who effectively had been separated from her mother. And I read them in a state of grief and distress for a child who no longer existed, in a sense, because the child was now subsumed within the the perfectly happy and reasonably well-adjusted woman that I now am. And I thought also of her and wondered what it must have been like to be on the receiving end of these desperately sad letters. But anyway, there it is.
But you said in the book you really don't recall a separation as such.
I don't remember a particular moment. I just know that over a course of a summer, gradually she wasn't there anymore. I don't know how it was done, and I don't remember a day of sort of saying goodbye to her or anything, but I remember sort of finding somehow that she was gone. And I was by then in the care of my two grandmothers because of my parents' divorce. My father had not yet come back from the Middle East. He was having to wind up his affairs there and sort himself out before he could come back to England. So I'd been consigned to my grandmothers to look after, and they sort of passed me between them like a kind of parcel. They were both assiduously caring, and I've no doubt now, thinking about it, they were very worried about this this traumatized 12-year-old, whom neither of them, of course, would remember. They hadn't seen me since I was 6, so they'd parted from, just before the war, they'd parted from a perfectly sort of cheerful little 6-year-old, and what they got back was this anguished adolescent for whom the world had fallen apart, as it were. And between them, they cared for me. One, my paternal grandmother died, in fact, within a couple of years, but my maternal grandmother, who I was devoted to, became another kind of surrogate mother. She became a sort of mother to me. She was a very brisk and a kind of forthright and strong woman. And I think it's probably because of my debt to her and what she was to me and I feel now that the grandmotherly role is a very important one. I'm now a grandmother myself 3 times over.
And about to become a grandmother again.
Exactly, and I think that the grandmotherly role is a hugely important one. So I'm trying to be as good a grandmother as she was to me.
That was fortunate. You really don't say too much about that. You say you're a reasonably happy, well-adjusted adult, and yet you read this book and you think, how could a reasonably happy, well-adjusted adult who writes wonderful books come out of this terribly traumatic childhood? In such a shift as you must have experienced when you came back to England.
Well, I sometimes ask myself that question, and my husband sometimes says cheerfully, it's surprising you're as normal as you are. I think probably as an adolescent I'm sure deeply disturbed. I mean, I think a lot of adolescents are disturbed.
It's normal.
It's normal. It's a pretty awful time for everyone. But it was particularly awful, and I think maybe I kind of worked it out then. And but in solitude, I mean, this was long before the days when there would have been, the thought of help for someone like this. Yeah. Nowadays, a child like me would have had the therapists homing in like bees.
Yes.
But in those days, there was no such thing as counselling and therapy and so forth, so that it wouldn't have occurred to anybody that perhaps here was a child who needed a bit of help. And I just kind of worked it out. And I was sent then to a boarding school. And there is, or was, nothing more rigid and devastating than an English girls' boarding school. I don't know if they're like that nowadays, but then, they were, a segregated institution, of course, just girls. And girls can be very cruel to each other, and they can be particularly cruel to an outsider. And of course, I was very much an outsider. I didn't know any of the ropes, as it were. I wasn't like the other children because I had this different background. And then there was the matter of the divorce too, because divorce was relatively unusual in those days, and it wasn't the kind of thing that it is now, where parents split up and it would be talked about in a kind of relatively airy way. I'm quite sure that it's still a traumatic experience for children, but then it carried with it a kind of social stigma. There were only very few other children in this school, of probably about 80 or 100 children. I think there were only about 2 others who had divorced parents. And I remember being summoned by the headmistress and told that, the implication that this was that this was distinctly reprehensible and quite possibly in some indirect way my fault, and that it would be best to keep quiet about this. This is not something you talk about, Penelope. I know your parents are divorced, but this is not something you must talk about. And this extended sort of beyond that a bit, that I got, you had the feeling that divorce was something to be talked about in hushed tones in an aside, and only by adults anyway. So that was another kind of stain on things, and that had to be got round and got over in some way as well.
You say you were even reprimanded for having read the Oxford Book of English Verse on your own time, because they would teach you that.
Well, it was an extraordinarily, it now seems to me, dramatically kind of Philistine school. It was quite the wrong school for the sort of child that I was. I was a sort of bookish child. I enjoyed reading. I'd had this odd kind of intimate amateur education with Lucy, where what we mainly did was read to each other, and we were both deeply committed to books and reading, and I loved
Sounds
books
wonderful.
and reading. Exactly, it was in many ways. And here I was now suddenly flung into a school where the whole ethos was completely different. It was a school where the heroines were the good games players, and to be good at work was considered, on the whole, not a terribly good thing. There was the distinct impression that if you shone academically, well, all right, so be it, but you were a bit of a dull fish. And I was quite a bright child as well, and I enjoyed work. I enjoyed learning, so that was a problem as well in a school where this was not, in a sense, encouraged. One of the punishments, in fact, in this school was to go and read for an hour in the library. Which rather sums it up. And
that's appalling.
And yes, I remember being sent for by the headmistress on one occasion, and she pushed across her desk towards me with a kind of red painted fingernail my copy of the Oxford Book of English Verse, which had been removed from my locker. We only had a very small area of privacy, a sort of little cupboard in which you could keep your few personal possessions, and this had been removed by an assiduous matron and confiscated as an odd thing to keep in your locker, and given to the headmistress, who pushed it at me and said, "There's no need for you to read this kind of thing in your spare time, Penelope. You will be taught all that." So that was the attitude to poetry, and I in fact wrote poetry in those days. I never have since, but I attempted to write poetry as an adolescent, but by then I was wised up, and I realized that this was not a thing that you would tell anybody about. So I kept this deeply hidden, this kind of awful subversive activity, or indeed reading, which clearly was a subversive activity as well. I can remember reading privately and concealing the fact that I enjoyed reading, until eventually I escaped and escaped into the sunlight of a university and discovered that other 18-year-olds had been reading quite openly for years.
Well, we are glad that you wrote, and we thank everybody for joining us today in a discussion with Penelope Lively.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.